Welcome once again to our webinar this evening. We're picking up on chapter 18 in the Bhagavad Gita. We're going to start tonight with stanzas 36 and go through 39. And as I mentioned last week, some of these things that are mentioned in chapter 18 have been covered again before in the Bhagavad Gita, and here, because this is the last chapters, Sri Krishna is summing up what has gone before to Arjuna. And in these stanzas, he's talking about the nature of bliss and the nature of happiness. I'd like to read, starting with stanza 36. Now hear from me, O best of the Bharatas, the three kinds of happiness. Transcendent above, which is supreme bliss, the consequence of continuous inwardness of mind. In bliss alone does one achieve the end of all sorrow. That happiness which is called sattvic seems in the beginning like poison, but in the end is like nectar and leads to the clear perception of self. That happiness which is rajasic, which arises from contact of the senses with their objects. It seems like nectar in the beginning, but in the end is like poison. That elusive happiness is termed tamasic, which begins and ends in the deluded stupor of oversleep, drunkenness, and slovenliness. And here in these stanzas, Krishna begins by saying, we're going to be speaking about happiness, but then he makes the point of saying that bliss is beyond happiness. And what he's referencing here is that what everybody wants in life is bliss. But bliss is something that's transcendent, that's beyond the qualities. Bliss, in other words, is not something that in the human state of duality in which we live, if we're acting under the influence of ego, we cannot really experience bliss. Bliss is God, Brahman itself. And it's beyond the qualities, and as long as we're in that state of duality, we're going to be experiencing a dilution of that infinite bliss, which is expressed through the various ups and downs and qualities, sattva, rajas, and tamas, that we experience in life, embodied in the body, embodied and embraced by the ego, in bondage to the ego. But once we go beyond that bondage to the ego, that is when we experience pure bliss. So bliss is filtered. Bliss is unconditional. Bliss is something that does not depend upon what happens outside of ourselves. It's not something that it has a up and down to it. It's not, you cannot have a higher form of bliss or a lesser form of bliss. Bliss simply is. But in this relative world, in which we find ourselves bound by ego, in this relative world, we experience that in the form of happiness. And the happiness is conditional. We can have extreme, beautiful happiness, but happiness is always in relation, you might say, to something else. There's a higher form of happiness and a lower form of happiness. A more refined happiness, a more gross happiness. On the grosser levels, he speaks about tamoguna, happiness expressed in tamoguna is expressed through, people find their happiness through drunkenness or slovenliness, it might even says. Rajaguna might be considered more pleasure. It's that happiness that is experienced when something pleasurable happens to us. It's just through the senses. We're being able to, something happens outwardly, and through the senses we process that, and then we like it or we don't like it. Happy, sad, that duality that's always there. And of course then he references sattva-gunas. That sattva-guna is that happiness which sometimes seems like poison at first, but turns out ultimately to be nectar. In other words, it's something we aspire to, and because we aspire to it, we have to sometimes put a little bit of effort into it. But in the end, we know that it was all worth it. It was a higher form of happiness. It required some input from our side, and that it's that highest, most refined expression of happiness. Well, we have covered this, I think, more than once perhaps in our discourses before. And it's somewhat, I think, self-evident to people. But what I wanted to mention this evening, how to pick this up, string by which to pick this up, is something that Swami Kriyananda said in his commentaries. It's not in the Gita itself, but if you read his commentaries, he makes a very interesting point, particularly in relation to tamaguna, the tamasic element. But it's something he mentions in relation to this particular reading, but it implies to everything in relationship to the tamaguna. And it's this: we find in our life sometimes there's an attraction. Tamaguna has an attraction. We say, well, how can that be? I mean, we're taught that it's bliss that we want, and we want the higher forms of happiness, and there's an aspiration in the soul itself toward God, toward Brahman. But yet, we also have to recognize that there's also an attraction toward the darkness. We have an aspiration to the light, but the darkness has a magnetism too. And this is what he's referring to when he mentions that tamaguna is something that it's magnetic based upon, as he phrases it, it's rooted in old habits, and a magnetism that's rooted in old habits. And what we must remember is that as the soul is evolved, it's evolved from a lower state. Not the soul doesn't evolve the way it expresses, you could say, it's evolved. The soul is infinitely one. But embodied in form, it first takes that embodiment in lower forms, lower animal forms, and slowly it works its way up to the human level, and then slowly works its way up into a greater and greater awareness until we can find our freedom. Well, as we've worked our way up, we have to remember that our history of bondage is in the past, in a less aware form. And have you ever heard that phrase? A person says, "Oh, are you happy?" He says, "Yes, I'm happy as a clam." And that's a saying in America, at least. I'm happy as a clam. Now that doesn't make any logical sense at all, because clams probably are not happy or sad. They probably have very little awareness to be one or the other. But yet it reflects a certain consciousness. A person says they're happy as a clam because a clam, you can imagine in the nice water, it's perhaps a warm water, it's sitting there in the mud, not having to do much. It's content, there's no troubles, all it has to do is breathe in and breathe out the seawater. And so it's unchallenged, you might say. And so a person would say, I'm happy as a clam, meaning that there's no worries, no challenges, and they're just resting in a sentient state. Well, that's not really what happiness is about, but it conveys that there's a French phrase, nostalgie de la boue. And that's one of those phrases. What it means is nostalgia for the mud. And there's a consciousness within us, a subconscious longing, you might say, that's buried very deep, but you might say it's even in the genes itself. It's buried in this memory, this subconscious soul memory of having been in the past and coming from that state of inertia, you might say, and having to aspire upward. The soul longs for freedom from bondage, but that ascent up the evolutionary ladder of consciousness is in any ascent, there's a certain struggle there. We have to work at it. We have to work at becoming more aware. We have to put energy out. We have to summon that energy. We have to strengthen the will. And all of that, to a person who perhaps is more of a tamasic nature, says, oh, do I have to? And that person of tamasic nature that quality exists in you and it exists in me. It's just part of the way that this universe is made. If you take a magnet with the North Pole and the South Pole, positive pole, negative pole, if you cut the magnet at any point, a bar magnet, if you cut it at any point, one side of that magnet is always going to be positive, the other side is always going to be magnetic. So long as we're in the realm of duality, no matter how advanced, how great the saint is, as long as that saint, there's some element of that consciousness still in this world of duality, you cut that magnet, and there's going to be a tamasic and a sattvic side. Now that tamasic side may manifest as something that I would consider sattvic perhaps, but nevertheless, that sattvic side, not so much in its expression, but in the direction that it's pointing, you see. If there's going to be a directional point that is moved, that could, if encouraged and if fed, can move in that direction toward negativity. And so there's this, and it's based upon, you might say, a soul memory for that time when we long at times to go back to sleep. Have you ever woken up in the morning? Sometimes you've had a hard day, perhaps you didn't get to sleep at night, and you wake up in the morning and you remember that you have all these different appointments that you have to go to that day, and you go, oh no, you can't hardly face it. And what you want to do is you want to pull the blanket up over your head and just go back to sleep. Have you ever felt like that? Sometimes the world is like that. We want to escape from it. We see there's something, a struggle comes up, and we go, oh, not again. Why do I always have to be working so hard in life? And that reluctant tendency, you see, that unwilling tendency, can I just avoid this? That tendency is something that, and perhaps one person manifests very overtly, but nevertheless, it's not the specific of the tendency, but it's the energy behind that tendency. That is the tamoguna. And we have to be careful, because although it's there, and we don't necessarily always see it, we may have overcome it, we think, it's latent, just within the nature of how this world is made. And so, that being the case, there's a couple of things that I think there's a positive side to remember about that. Sometimes people, they pull the covers up over their head and they say, I'm not going to do it, I don't want to do it. Then they feel guilty about it, whether it's that, avoiding something, or perhaps they fall into bad habits, and something has drawn them into negativity, and they feel very guilty about it. And in the process of feeling guilty, the mind is saying, I failed, I created that negativity. And we have to remember, we don't create that negative pull. That negative pull is part of the universe itself. It's Maya. That is Maya's influence, and we don't create Maya. Maya is there, and so we didn't create, as you could say, as they say, you may be, it's woe to him who, or it's temptation. It's like we don't create temptation, but what we can do is we can resist it or we can succumb to it. But don't feel bad if you find yourself in life tempted, if you find yourself perhaps even making mistakes. You didn't create the energy that put that mistake, that temptation for that mistake before you, but you didn't have the strength to resist it. And so consequently, you might say it's best not to even identify with it. It's not you. You have the power, however, to resist or not to resist, to succumb to that pull, to sink back into the mud, to not face the struggle of life or whatever you're resisting. You have the strength to resist that unwillingness that springs up in all of us, because all of us are unwilling to some degree. You can't say that, oh, that person, he's not unwilling. Well, he may not express unwilling, but everybody has that potential, you see, to express it on some level, no matter where they are. Just in the same way that no matter how sluggish or how tamasic a person is, they have the sattvic potential as well. It's at that direction. If they choose to point themselves in that sattvic direction, that's progress for them. Then, if you're pointing, then you can take a step. Sooner or later, energy will manifest in them to force them to take steps. And if they're in a positive, directed in a positive direction, you're going to take a positive step. And so this is for us to remember. Don't give energy to that direction, and don't identify it. Don't even think it's yours. This is part of the nature of things. Now, there's a couple of other points I wanted to make about this. This is something that Arjuna, when we start the Bhagavad Gita, you could say this is also part of his dilemma as well. He finds himself in between the two armies, and he's asking himself, why do I want to fight this battle? And he comes up with all of the reasons why he shouldn't fight this battle and take up this challenge. But it's also, this is in a sense, this reluctance to take up the battle of life, to think that, well, it's all going to go away, I don't have to deal with this. And you may be right, it might go away for a little while, but it really doesn't go away for long. Sooner or later, you have to come back and face whatever that struggle is. So consequently, going back to that image of pulling the covers up over our heads, sooner or later, you're going to have to pull them down to go to work. It doesn't last. So you only make the situation worse if you do that. And you'll notice, I've noticed this about a reluctance on my own part to face anything difficult in life. Sometimes you have little fears. You don't want to, I remember once I borrowed a book from a gentleman, a man. I was a young man, he was an elderly man. And he lent me the book, and I knew he's very attached to his books. And he gave me that book because he recommended I read it, and so I took it. And he said, now bring it back to me in about 2 weeks. Yes, I did, and I forgot. I put it on the shelf, I forgot. About a month or two later, I went and I saw the book on the shelf. I says, oh my God, here's this book, and I know he's going to be angry with me because he's very attached to these things. And he's a prickly man. And I said, oh, what am I going to do? Well, I was so afraid to bring the book back to him that I just left it on the shelf. And it didn't solve the problem, of course. And sooner or later, I think it was after 6 months, I finally went back and had to abjectly apologize for bringing this book back. And he never lent me another book again. That was the last time. And he just gave me the cold shoulder treatment. Well, it just made it worse. Now that was a simple little story, but there are many things I think we can all substitute in our own life, or things that we've been refused to face, and we go around them and we say, I don't want to face it, maybe it'll go away. And it doesn't go away. And if you have a fear, you have something that you can't face, you can't put it aside. Now there are times when you says, well, I cannot face it yet. But you can't bury it. Sometimes you realize you can't face it yet, and then what you're doing in the meantime, I hope, is summoning up the resources and the strength to allow you to face it, because it's a wise thing to know your capabilities. If you can't do something that you know you have to face, and you do something to prepare yourself, well, that's one thing. But to completely ignore it is another thing. And one of the things I think all of us need to face is we have to face the dilemma that we find ourselves in spiritually. I think all of us, if we're on the spiritual path, if you're watching this webinar tonight, you have an interest in spirituality, all of us face the challenge of giving ourselves to God, to transcending this littleness and ego. We are facing that challenge. And because we face in that challenge, implicit in that is there has been gone out from us an invitation to the divine to give us the challenges that we want on some deep level, or perhaps we need, in order for us to overcome our limitations. So on the one hand, we don't want challenges, where there's that tendency of us to resist them, but on the other hand, there should be, if we've taken up the spiritual life, a recognition that in some way we've asked Divine Mother, we've asked Guru, we've asked God to actually give us those things that we need in life. And so when the challenges come, what is the attitude to take? The attitude to take is to be grateful for whatever it is that's come to us and see them as coming from Divine Mother or for coming from Guru. And if we can see what comes to us is, yes, this is something that's been given to me as an opportunity, then we move toward that challenge, we respond to the challenge, and we're not moving away and succumbing to that, you might say, that magnetic drift back into the past, that nostalgie de la boue of avoidance for that. And so we're going forward, and if we approach whatever challenge with that attitude of saying, okay, I'll go forward, we'll find that somehow we summon the support to be able to overcome whatever challenge it is, and we have the right attitude to approach those challenges. One other point about this, I mentioned that these are, you might say, the magnetism, as I said, or as Swami said actually, I'm quoting him, the magnetism from habits from the past. Habits do have magnetism, and sometimes we think that, oh, that used to be a habit of mine, I don't have it anymore. I hope that's true, but don't kid yourself. Habits have a way of embedding themselves on a very deep level. It's said that habits even reside on the cellular level, in the cells themselves. And it's very interesting that modern genetics even is somewhat confirming that. There's this part of genetics known as epigenetics, which shows that how what you do in life embeds itself, actually transforms and chemically embeds itself on the in the cells themselves, and even on the genetic level. That we begin to modify the genes I don't want to get scientific here too much, but how the genes are shaped, how they produce and manufacture proteins, these become modified by our behavior. And in the process of doing that, they trigger certain responses in us. So consequently, we may have genetic predispositions for them, but they don't manifest. Whereas another person may have the same genetic predisposition, but they do. And why is that? Oftentimes, it's because what we do in this life actually, you might say, modifies those triggers. And overcoming the habits doesn't mean that those trigger mechanisms, even on a very cellular level, have been overcome. It takes a long time for them to be displaced. I've heard it said that on average, the body replaces all of its cells, except for the nerve cells, all of its cells roughly between 5 to 10 years, 5, 7, 8 years, something like that. We're not the same person we were 10 years ago, literally. The genes and all the cells, not the genes, but the cells themselves have replaced themselves. And so if our habits, some of those things that we ingrain in ourselves are on that level, don't assume that just because you think that you have overcome it, you haven't. They're on a very deep level. This is what Master said too. He says, if you want to change a bad habit to a good habit, it takes 5 to 8 years to do that. And perhaps he was saying that in reference because of this fact. But it may not be on the surface level. So don't give energy even to those little things, those little trifles that you might think that you had a bad habit in the past. Keep yourself pointed in the positive direction. That's what we can do. We don't really have a great deal of choice. Much of what we come into this life is dictated by our karma. But remember, who created that karma? We did. And so every day, every moment, you could say, we are laying the foundation for our future. Perhaps we're creating the karma of tomorrow, today. And so, in what direction are we pointed? And as it's been said many times by many great souls, the minutes are more important than the days. And so if in each moment we ask ourselves, which way am I pointed? Am I pointed toward the, as long as I'm embodied in this body, my soul is bound, and I understand that, and I'm in the realm of duality, try to refine your sense of happiness. Try to uplift that. Point yourself toward the light and go toward that. But behind it all, remember that even happiness, or even you might say chains, are like chains of gold. And chains of gold, they too bind. Don't be conditioned. Place in your condition of happiness, of bliss, what happens outside yourself. When you can learn to be happy inside, whatever happens outside, just be content inside the world, even in the midst of crashing worlds, then you'll know you have something very precious. When nothing outside of you can touch you, then you'll know, you'll start to begin to feel, and you're beginning to touch God's bliss. And that's what we want. We want to have God's bliss. Remember, Swami said, this is what we want to give first to ourselves, but at the same time, we want to share that. It says, give people bliss. That's what we have to do. Give people bliss. Give ourselves that bliss.